The automatic doors of the Westbrook Mall slid open with a low hiss, letting in a gust of cold morning air. Daniel adjusted his crutches under his arms and shifted the weight of his backpack carefully. Inside the bag, nestled safely in a small carrier, was Silver, his beloved Chinchilla, peeking out at the world with wide, curious eyes. Today was supposed to be a celebration. After months of painful rehabilitation and surgeries, Daniel had finally convinced his doctors to let him walk short distances on his own. Not far, not fast, but enough to remind himself that he was alive, that he could still fight for a piece of normalcy. Shoppers bustled around him, their footsteps echoing across the gleaming tiles. Bright advertisements flashed on the walls, announcing sales and special offers, but Daniel barely noticed. All he cared about was the feeling of moving forward, step by careful step, crutches clicking steadily beneath him. A security guard stood near the entrance, arms crossed, his heavy black boots planted wide. His uniform was crisply pressed, his belt loaded with equipment that glinted under the mall's fluorescent lights. His eyes locked onto Daniel immediately, a look that lingered too long, too hard. Daniel felt the gaze burn into him but kept moving, pretending not to notice. It wasn't the first time people had stared. Being a disabled black teenager taught you to expect second glances, murmured judgments, and pitiful smiles. You learned to build a wall around yourself just to make it through the day. He tightened his grip on his crutches and kept walking. "Hey, kid!" The guard's voice sliced through the hum of the mall. "Where do you think you're going?" Daniel froze for a split second. He turned slightly, heart thudding harder now. He could feel Silver stirring inside the backpack, sensing the sudden tension. "Just going to the pet store," Daniel said carefully, forcing his voice to stay calm. The guard took a few slow, deliberate steps toward him. There was something in his expression, not concern, not suspicion, something uglier. His eyes darted to the crutches, the bag, then back to Daniel's face. "You carrying something illegal in there?" the guard asked, jerking his chin at the backpack. "No, sir. It's my Chinchilla. Her name's Silver," Daniel replied, trying to smile, trying to diffuse the situation before it got worse. The guard snorted, an ugly sound. "You people always have some excuse." The words hit harder than Daniel expected. "You people." A phrase soaked in contempt, heavy with accusation. Shoppers began to slow around them, pretending not to look while sneaking glances. Daniel felt heat crawl up his neck, not just from humiliation, but from anger. The kind of quiet, simmering anger he had been taught all his life to swallow. "I'm just going to the pet store," he repeated, voice thinner now, as if the air itself was getting harder to breathe. The guard took another step closer, his boots loud against the floor. The mall suddenly felt vast and empty, the crowds pulling back, leaving Daniel alone in the harsh fluorescent light. "Open the bag," the guard ordered. Daniel hesitated, his crutches wobbling slightly under him. Silver gave a soft, anxious chirp. I can't right now. I have to hold on to my crutches," Daniel said, his cheeks burning. Wrong answer. The guard's eyes darkened. His hand twitched toward the walkie-talkie at his belt, and in that moment, Daniel knew. This wasn't about a bag. It wasn't about rules. It was about him, about what he looked like, about how easily someone like him could be turned into a problem. Daniel tightened his jaw and stood as tall as he could, wobbling slightly, but refusing to let himself look afraid. "I'm not doing anything wrong," he said louder now, loud enough for the onlookers to hear. The guard's mouth twisted into a smirk. "Not yet," he said. "But give it a minute." And with that, he stepped forward, reaching for Daniel, not to help, not to support, but to control. In that instant, Daniel realized that no matter how carefully he moved, no matter how politely he spoke, some people had already decided who he was. And today, they weren't going to let him forget it. The guard's fingers clamped around the strap of Daniel's backpack, yanking it hard enough to make him stumble forward on his crutches. A gasp rose from the few onlookers who had lingered nearby, but no one stepped in. They simply watched, heads half turned, pretending to care, pretending to be helpless. "Stop!" Daniel cried, struggling to steady himself. His right crutch slipped against the polished tile, and he wobbled dangerously before regaining balance. You want to make this harder on yourself? The guard sneered, his voice carrying across the wide, sterile mall hallway. Resisting will only make it worse, boy. Boy. The word was coated in venom, a word Daniel had heard spat in anger too many times to mistake its meaning now. His heart hammered against his ribs. Every instinct screamed for him to back away, to protect himself, to run. But how could he? He could barely stand upright, let alone run. I didn't do anything, Daniel said, voice cracking despite himself. The guard ignored him. With one swift movement, he ripped the backpack from Daniel's shoulders. The sudden force made Daniel stagger backward. One crutch slipped from under his arm and clattered noisily onto the tile. Daniel dropped to one knee, the coldness of the floor seeping through his jeans. He could hear Silver squealing frantically from inside the bag, trapped and terrified. Look at you, the guard laughed cruelly. Can't even stand on your own, and you think you belong here with decent people? The cruelty in his words stung deeper than the fall. Daniel's face burned with humiliation. Around him, the shoppers who had been watching pretended once again to be deeply interested in their phones, in the shop windows, in anything but the boy on the floor. The guard unzipped the backpack roughly. Inside, Silver scrambled, her tiny claws scratching frantically at the soft lining. The guard's lip curled in disgust. You carrying rodents around now, he said loudly, holding up the small carrier for everyone to see. Figures, filthy creatures for filthy people. Daniel reached out desperately, trying to grab the bag back, but the guard only pulled it further away, dangling it like a trophy. Give her back, Daniel pleaded, but the guard shook his head, smirking. You people never learn, he said. You think you can just bring your trash into places like this and be treated like everyone else? The phrase, you people, rang in Daniel's ears louder than the blood rushing through his veins. The guard dropped the carrier onto the ground. Silver let out a tiny cry of fear. Without even a moment's hesitation, the guard lifted one boot over the carrier. Daniel screamed. No! Time slowed. The boot came down. The sickening crunch echoed through the hallway. Silence. Then the world crashed back into sound. Daniel's scream ripping through the stillness, the shocked gasps of a few witnesses, the clatter of his second crutch falling as he collapsed completely onto the floor. Silver's carrier lay shattered, broken pieces of plastic scattered across the tiles like the ruins of a battle no one else had dared to fight. The guard stood over him, unmoving, his face empty of regret, like this was just another day, just another problem crushed underfoot. Daniel reached out, his hands shaking violently, gathering the remains of the carrier, searching desperately for Silver. She was still. A low moan escaped his lips. A sound that didn't even seem human. A sound torn from somewhere deep inside. A place no one should ever have to reach. No one moved to help. No one spoke up. Daniel was invisible again, until it came time to punish him. Let's take a short pause. If you're listening to this story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and if you've ever experienced anything similar. Your stories matter to us. Make sure to subscribe so you never miss a new story. Now, let's continue. Daniel limped away from the scene, his crutch tapping unevenly on the smooth tile, the echoes bouncing down the long hallway like cruel reminders of what had just happened. Every step was agony, not just because of his aching leg, but because of the invisible wounds they had carved into him, wounds that would take far longer to heal than any broken bone. The world around him blurred. He couldn't even see the faces anymore, just shifting shapes moving quickly to get out of his way, as if his pain was contagious. He passed a cluster of mall staff near a kiosk. They had been there the whole time. He knew it. He had seen them glance over when the guard assaulted him, when Silver was crushed underfoot. They had seen everything and done nothing. Now, as Daniel hobbled by, one of them whispered to another, just loud enough for him to hear. Probably staged it for attention. You know how they are. The words hit like a slap, not just because of the cruelty, but because of how casually it was delivered, like it was an accepted truth, like it was something everyone already believed. Daniel's throat tightened. He didn't trust himself to speak, didn't trust that if he opened his mouth, he would be able to hold back the flood of grief and rage threatening to overwhelm him. He just kept moving, because he didn't know what else to do. Security cameras mounted on the walls followed his every step. He could feel the invisible eyes tracking him, judging him, not as a victim, but as a threat, as a disruption to the carefully constructed image of a clean, safe mall experience. A small boy, no older than 7, pointed at Daniel as he passed. "Mommy, why is he dirty?" The woman hushed him quickly, pulling him away, casting Daniel a brief glance filled with something between fear and disgust, like he was a stain, something to be cleaned away. Daniel swallowed hard and kept going. Each step felt heavier, like the weight of the mall itself was pressing down on him, pushing him lower and lower. When he finally reached a bench near the exit, he collapsed onto it, his crutch slipping from his hand and clattering to the ground. He didn't move to pick it up. He sat there, shoulders hunched, staring at the polished floor, watching the endless parade of clean shoes stepping briskly around him, avoiding him, pretending he didn't exist. Minutes passed, maybe longer. The pain in his leg was nothing compared to the pain in his chest. A security officer, not the one who had attacked him, but another, approached eventually, clipboard in hand, face a careful mask of professionalism. Daniel looked up at him, hope flickering faintly for just a second. Maybe now someone would ask if he was okay. Maybe now someone would see him. But the officer didn't ask if he was hurt. He didn't ask what happened. He just cleared his throat and said, "You're going to have to leave. Management doesn't want disturbances lingering." Disturbance. The word rang in Daniel's ears, sharp and cruel. He was a disturbance. Not a boy who had just lost his companion. Not a victim of unprovoked violence. Just a problem to be removed. Daniel started to say something, but his voice cracked and broke. He couldn't find the right words, the ones he needed to explain how wrong all of this was. The officer shifted impatiently. "I'll call for assistance if you can't move on your own," he said, not unkindly, but with the weary tone of someone who just wanted to finish their shift and not deal with any more issues. Daniel bent down painfully to retrieve his crutch. He gripped it tightly, forcing himself upright once more. His body screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of carrying him out like he was baggage. As he hobbled toward the exit, each step felt like walking through thick, clinging mud. Every breath was a battle against the despair clawing at the edges of his mind. He paused at the doors, feeling the cold air leaking in from outside. He turned back, just for a moment, looking once more at the shining floors, the perfect storefronts, the polished windows, a place that promised comfort and happiness, but had offered him nothing but cruelty and degradation. He had loved malls once. The energy, the noise, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. Now it felt like a place he would never belong to again, a place that had rejected him completely. Daniel pushed the door open and stepped out into the cold. Behind him, the mall swallowed up the scene as if it had never happened. Just another day, just another problem erased. The cold outside was biting. Daniel hadn't realized how long he had been sitting on the curb until his legs began to throb with the sharp reminder that they were still weak from his recent injury. His crutches lay beside him on the ground, and the world around him seemed a million miles away. He felt numb, not just physically, but emotionally too. The people, the voices, the stares, they had all blurred together into a fog of disbelief and anger. He wiped his face, still wet from the tears he hadn't even realized had been falling. He hadn't cried like this in a long time, not since the surgeries, the long nights in hospital beds, or the fear of his own body failing him. But today had shattered something inside him. Not just his crutches or his heart, but his trust in the world around him, in people, in humanity. He looked back at the mall, the glossy windows reflecting an image of what was supposed to be a safe, everyday space. But to him, the mall now felt like an impenetrable fortress, a place where his worth was measured not by his actions, but by his skin, his disability, and the way others perceived him. He hadn't made it far before the memories of what had happened began to crash down on him again. The guard's hands on him, the way he had yanked the bag from his back, the sickening crunch of his beloved pet under the guard's boot. Why did it have to happen this way? Daniel muttered to himself, staring at the cracked pavement. Why does it always have to be this way? A sharp gust of wind whipped through the street, carrying with it the sounds of life going on. Cars honking, people laughing, phones buzzing. But Daniel felt as if he were suspended outside of it all, in a world where nothing mattered. His own life felt like it had lost its colour, a dull grey that wouldn't go away. A woman walked past him, her high heels clicking on the pavement. She glanced at him, but didn't stop. Didn't speak, just looked at him like he was part of the scenery, something that didn't belong, something that didn't matter. That glance was enough to push him further into the silence that seemed to wrap around him like a suffocating blanket. The ache in his chest intensified. It wasn't just his physical pain from his leg. It was the emptiness left by everyone's indifference, by the cruelty that seeped through the world without even a second glance. "Why didn't anyone help me?" he whispered to the empty street. His voice cracked, thick with frustration. "Why is it always like this?" For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt truly small. The tears came back, and he couldn't stop them this time. His shoulders shook as he buried his face in his hands. The rage inside him burned, but it was hopeless. There was no one around to stand up for him, no one to listen. Then, just as quickly as the storm of emotions had started, something shifted inside him. There was a flash, a realization, deep and primal, that struck him like a lightning bolt. I am not invisible. It hit him with such force that he froze. His chest heaved, and for the first time since the guard had shattered his crutches, he felt a flicker of defiance. I am not invisible. I won't let them erase me. Daniel wiped his face with the back of his hand, his breath coming in ragged sobs. He wasn't sure what he was going to do next, but he knew one thing. He couldn't keep going like this, letting people like that guard dictate his life, making him feel like nothing. The sound of a voice cut through his thoughts, a familiar voice. "Hey, are you all right?" Daniel looked up. A tall figure stood at the edge of the sidewalk, their face half hidden in shadow, but their concern was evident. It was a young man, perhaps in his 20s, with scruffy brown hair and a jacket that seemed too big for him. He was looking at Daniel, eyes wide with genuine worry, something Daniel hadn't seen in a while. The young man stepped forward cautiously. "I saw what happened. Back there, with that guard. Are you okay?" For a moment, Daniel couldn't respond. The words felt trapped inside him, buried beneath layers of hurt and anger. But this stranger, he hadn't turned away. He hadn't pretended that nothing had happened. "No," Daniel finally whispered, his voice raw. "No, I'm not okay." The young man nodded slowly, his eyes dark with understanding. He glanced back at the mall, then back at Daniel, and without saying anything else, he sat down next to him on the curb. He didn't ask Daniel to talk. He just sat there, waiting. Daniel, still trembling, glanced at the stranger. He was older than him, but the warmth in his eyes made Daniel feel human again. He wasn't a burden. He wasn't invisible. "They always treat me like this," Daniel muttered, his words soft. "I just wanted to get through the day, to be normal. But I don't even know what that is anymore. They've taken everything from me." The young man stayed quiet for a while. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't feel as cold. There was something in the way the stranger sat beside him, silently acknowledging the pain that made the sharp edge of his grief soften, just a little. "You know," the young man said after a moment, his voice steady, "they don't get to decide who you are. They don't get to erase you, or put you in a box, or make you feel less than. You've got every right to be here, to take up space, just like anyone else. Don't let them take that from you." Daniel blinked, not sure if he had heard right. The words felt strange, like a distant echo that he had never expected to hear, but somehow they felt true. "You have to fight," the stranger continued, his gaze unwavering. "You don't have to take this, Daniel. Not anymore." Daniel looked at him, his heart pounding in his chest. How did this stranger know his name? But before he could ask, the young man pointed to a nearby phone on the ground. Someone had left it there when they passed, and it was still open to a social media feed. The screen displayed a video, a clip of the incident that had just unfolded in the mall, the one where the guard had crushed Silver. Daniel's stomach twisted. His mind raced. The video was everywhere. The world was watching. And they had just witnessed his pain, his humiliation. "People are seeing this," the young man said quietly. "This is your moment, Daniel. You don't have to stay silent. You can turn this around." Daniel swallowed hard. He had been silent for so long, suffocating under the weight of it all. He had always felt small, powerless, but the world was now listening. This is not the end. The words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, Daniel felt like he might actually have a voice that could make a difference, that could be heard. "I'm not going to let them do this to me," Daniel said, his voice stronger now, a spark of something new starting to burn inside him. The young man gave him a nod, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "I'm with you, man. Let's make sure they hear your story." Daniel glanced back at the mall, where the shadow of his grief still loomed. But now, there was something else there, something that hadn't been there before, a flicker of hope, and for the first time in a long time, he believed it. The days after the release of the video passed in a blur, the weight of the world pressing harder on Daniel's shoulders with each passing hour. The small victory he had felt at first, the satisfaction of finally being heard, soon gave way to a growing sense of unease, a bitter realization that things wouldn't change so easily. He was no longer just a teenager with a broken leg and a damaged heart. He was now the face of a larger conversation, one that brought with it not just support, but endless hate. At school, the looks came first. The whispers followed soon after. It was like a dark cloud had descended over him, and no matter where he went, no matter what corner he tried to hide in, it followed. The students who had once been his classmates, people he had known for years, now looked at him like a foreign object. Their glances were full of pity, of judgment. Some were openly hostile, as if his pain had become their problem, as if his suffering was something to be resented. He couldn't escape it. He couldn't run. It was in the halls between classes, when the crowd was thick and the noise deafening, that Daniel felt most alone. No one had said a word to him, but the air around him had changed. The way they looked at him, talked about him when they thought he wasn't listening, it was enough to make his skin crawl. "You know, I don't get it," one girl in his math class said, her voice cutting through the chatter. "Why does he have to make such a big deal out of it? I mean, it's just a pet. People get pets all the time." Daniel's head snapped up at the comment. His chest tightened, his throat closed, as the words hit him like a punch to the gut. Just a pet. Silver had been his companion for years, through surgeries, through nights when the pain in his leg was unbearable, through all the loneliness that came with being different. She had been his comfort, the only thing that truly made him feel whole, and now, just a pet. As if she hadn't mattered at all. "Shut up," someone from across the room muttered, though Daniel wasn't sure if they were speaking to him or to her. Either way, it didn't make him feel any better. It didn't make the words hurt any less. The days became unbearable, each one blending into the next as he tried to navigate this new world that seemed to turn its back on him. The online comments, the messages, the videos, everything was a constant reminder that he wasn't just the victim of one man's cruelty. He was the victim of something much bigger, something much older. He was the victim of a world that hated him for things he couldn't change. His skin, his disability, his very existence. And no matter how much he tried to fight it, no matter how hard he pushed back, the hatred wouldn't stop. Every time he opened his phone, there it was again. The messages, the insults, the people who saw his pain and chose to mock it, to twist it into something it wasn't. "You should have known better than to bring your kind into a public place. What did you expect, asking for trouble with your animal?" These words felt like acid on his skin. They burned with the same old familiar cruelty that had been inflicted on people like him for centuries. He had always known it was there, the racism that simmered just beneath the surface of every smile, every interaction. He had known what people thought of him before they ever said a word. But now, with the whole world watching, with the spotlight on his pain, it was impossible to ignore. He had become a symbol of something he never asked to represent. He was the black kid, the disabled kid. the one who was always on the outside looking in. And now, people were paying attention to him, not because they cared, but because his suffering was convenient for their narratives. Daniel's thoughts spiraled. He began questioning everything. The reasons he had kept his head down, the way he had tried to avoid confrontation, the way he had let the world shape him into something small and unimportant. Why had he let it go on for so long? Why had he accepted that this was his place in the world? The anger bubbled up again, stronger now, more intense than before. He wasn't just angry at the guard or the people who had turned away. He was angry at himself for believing for even a second that he deserved to be treated like less. One evening, after another long day of whispers and stares, Daniel sat in his room, staring at his phone. He had received another message. It wasn't the first time, but this one felt different. It was from a local activist group, a message of solidarity, a group that had been protesting similar incidents in the city. They had seen the video, they had heard his story, and they wanted him to join them in their efforts to bring change, to demand justice for the mistreatment he had suffered. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a flicker of hope. Maybe this was the chance he had been waiting for. Maybe he wasn't alone in this fight. But even then, doubt crept in. He didn't know how to do this. He didn't know how to stand up for himself, let alone lead a movement. He had spent his entire life learning how to blend in, how to avoid attention. Now, he was being asked to step into the light, to speak up, to be the face of something bigger than himself. The pressure was overwhelming. His mind raced, torn between the fear of being crushed under the weight of it all and the burning need to be heard, to make sure his voice wasn't lost in the sea of noise. What if this didn't work? What if it only made things worse? That night, he barely slept. He tossed and turned, his thoughts spiraling. By morning, however, something had shifted. The fear was still there, lurking in the background, but it was no longer enough to keep him silent. He had a choice. He could let them keep pushing him down, or he could stand up. He could fight back. And so, he made his decision. He would take the next step. He would speak out, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been silenced, who had been treated like they didn't matter. He would let the world see him, hear him, and know that he was not going to be erased. He picked up his phone, opened the activist group's message, and typed his response. "I'm in." The road ahead would not be easy. The hate would continue. The prejudice would persist. But Daniel now understood one thing. He wasn't fighting alone anymore. He had found his voice, and with it, he would never be silenced again. The days after Daniel had posted the video blurred together. At first, he felt a strange sense of hope, a small ember in his chest that flickered against the cold winds of the world around him. The message from the activist group had been a lifeline, a sign that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't alone. But as the reality of the situation set in, that hope quickly mixed with fear. He had chosen to speak up. He had chosen to stand out. But now, with every text message, every notification, every comment, Daniel felt the weight of that decision pressing on him. His phone buzzed constantly, the sound becoming almost unbearable as he tried to sift through the endless stream of messages. Some were supportive, others were harsh, even cruel, but they all shared one thing in common. Daniel had become a symbol, and symbols were always under attack. He began receiving more and more direct messages from people who hated him, from people who believed he was making the whole thing up, or worse, from those who saw him as an embodiment of everything they feared. "You're just looking for attention," one person wrote. "You're a disgrace to this country." Another comment read, "If you'd just known your place, this wouldn't have happened. Keep whining." The words felt like daggers, each one cutting deeper than the last. But the thing that hurt the most wasn't the insult itself. It was the fact that this kind of hatred was so deeply embedded in society. These weren't isolated incidents. They weren't the words of a few bad apples. This was a systemic issue. The anger Daniel felt was not just directed at him. It was part of something bigger, something that reached far beyond a single incident. The pressure of being constantly under scrutiny, constantly criticized, weighed on him. He began to question himself. What if he was wrong? What if he was just another victim of his own mind, blown out of proportion by the attention he had received? His self-doubt gnawed at him, making him question the path he had chosen. But the doubt never fully consumed him. Deep down, Daniel knew the truth. He knew he couldn't back down now. He had seen the indifference, the cruelty, the apathy in the eyes of the people who had stood by and done nothing. If he gave up now, it wouldn't just be a failure for him. It would be a failure for everyone who had ever been ignored, dismissed, or treated as less than. The activist group reached out again, asking him to attend a protest rally that was being organized in response to his video. It was an opportunity to take the next step, to turn his pain into something powerful. But the fear still lingered. Could he really do it? Could he stand in front of a crowd, knowing that there would be people who hated him for simply existing? He spent the night thinking it over, pacing his room, the weight of the decision pressing harder as the hours passed. Eventually, the exhaustion took over and he fell asleep. But even in his dreams, the world wouldn't stop turning. The words, the stares, the hate, and the love were all mixed together, swirling in a storm of emotion that refused to let him rest. By the time the rally day arrived, Daniel had made his decision. He would go. He would show up, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever felt silenced, for everyone who had ever been told they didn't belong. He was going to make them hear him. The morning of the rally, Daniel dressed in clothes that felt too tight, too formal for a day like this, but he didn't care. He was tired of being small. He was tired of shrinking to fit into the spaces others had carved out for him. He was ready to take up space. He was ready to take a stand. When he arrived at the rally, he was surprised by the number of people who had shown up. The crowd was large, diverse, and filled with people who shared his pain, his anger, and his desire for change. He wasn't alone anymore. The energy in the air was electric. It felt like the moment had finally arrived, the moment when everything he had suffered, everything he had endured, could finally be used for something greater than himself. But even in the sea of people, even with so many others standing by his side, Daniel felt the weight of the world on him. He knew the eyes of the crowd were on him, waiting for him to say something, to lead them forward. And then it happened. A man from the crowd, someone Daniel didn't recognize, stepped forward and made a beeline toward him. At first, Daniel thought the man might be there to support him, to offer a handshake or a word of encouragement. But when the man got closer, Daniel saw the look in his eyes. It wasn't respect. It wasn't support. It was disgust. "You're nothing but trouble," the man spat, his words low but sharp, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "You think you're better than us, don't you? This is why people like you don't belong here." Daniel froze. The words felt like a slap, like a punch to the gut. His body tensed as the man got even closer, his face twisted with hatred. There were others nearby, but they didn't intervene. They just watched. They let the man speak, let him get his anger out. "All of this," the man continued, his voice rising, "it's your fault. You're the reason this world is so messed up, always playing the victim, always looking for a handout." The crowd was silent now. It was as if everyone was waiting for Daniel to react, to say something, to do something. But he couldn't move. His body was locked in place, his mind racing with all the things he wanted to say. "I'm not the enemy. I'm not the one causing the problem." But the words wouldn't come. The man stepped closer, his breath hot on Daniel's face. "You're just like the rest of them," he sneered, his voice low and threatening. "You'll never be one of us. You'll never be enough." The insult stung more than it should have. Daniel's hands clenched into fists, but he didn't react. He wouldn't give this man the satisfaction. This man wasn't his enemy. His enemy was the system that allowed people like him to get away with this. The system that saw Daniel as less than. The system that reduced his humanity to a stereotype. The crowd began to murmur, shifting uncomfortably. Some people stepped back, others turned away. But Daniel stayed still. He had made his choice. He was here to speak out, to make sure that the world saw him, that the world saw all of them. He couldn't let this man, or anyone else, take that away from him. With a deep breath, Daniel turned and faced the crowd. His voice was steady when he spoke, but his heart was racing. Every day, we live with this. We live with the hate, with the prejudice, with the assumption that we don't belong. But we do. We belong here. We belong everywhere, and we will no longer be silent. The crowd erupted into applause, but the man, the one who had tried to silence him, was already walking away, muttering under his breath. For the first time in a long while, Daniel felt a spark of something he hadn't felt before. Hope. The days after Daniel's speech at the rally were a whirlwind. The words he had spoken had rippled through the community, through social media, and into the wider world. The world had heard his voice, and now there was no turning back. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was a fight shared by thousands of others who had been forced into silence, who had lived under the same crushing weight of prejudice, racism, and inequality. The local news picked up on his story. What had begun as a viral video had evolved into something larger. A symbol, a movement. The press descended on him, asking questions, trying to capture the essence of his pain and his resolve. But it wasn't the media that had changed his world. It was the people. Messages poured in, not just from strangers, but from people Daniel had known his whole life. Some were apologizing, some were offering their support, and others, surprisingly, were asking how they could help. Friends from school who had never bothered to speak up now stood beside him, offering their voices in solidarity. A few even joined him at protests and rallies, marching for the cause that had sparked something deeper in them all. But there were others. People who had always been in his life, people who claimed to care, but now viewed him differently. His own family, those who had once given him encouragement, now seemed uneasy. It wasn't that they didn't believe in him, but they were scared. They feared the repercussions of him speaking out. They didn't want him to be the target of more hatred. "Daniel," his mother said one evening, her voice heavy with concern, "you've got to be careful. You don't know how dangerous this can get. They'll come for you. They'll make you a target. They'll make it worse." "I'm already a target," Daniel replied, his voice steady but filled with an emotion he couldn't name. "If I don't speak up now, I'll never be able to live with myself. I can't keep hiding, not anymore." His mother's eyes softened, but the worry never left her face. "I know," she whispered. I don't want to lose you. You're my son. You don't deserve this. None of this is your fault." The conversations at home were the hardest. The support was there, but it was tangled with fear. It was difficult for anyone who loved him to watch him step into a battle that they knew could break him, could break them all. But Daniel wasn't backing down. He couldn't. Not now. As the rallies and protests grew larger, so did the risks. The conversations on social media escalated from hatred to outright threats. The most disturbing were the ones sent anonymously, laced with racism, anger, and intimidation. "I know where you live. You won't be safe for long. Next time, it won't just be your pet that gets crushed." The words were terrifying. Daniel felt the cold sweat on the back of his neck every time he opened his phone, every time a new message popped up. But the more they tried to silence him, the more it pushed him forward. He couldn't turn back now, not after everything. It wasn't just the threats from strangers that kept him up at night. It was the question that gnawed at him in the quiet hours. What if this was all for nothing? What if nothing changed? What if all his pain, his rage, his vulnerability, everything he had put into this, was nothing but a flash in the pan? But then he thought about the people who had reached out to him. The ones who said they finally understood. The ones who said that his words had changed their lives. And in those moments, the fear faded just a little. He couldn't give up. Not while there were people like him, people who had been treated the same, who had been told the same lies. They needed someone to fight. They needed him to keep going. One evening, after another long day of interviews and protests, Daniel sat in his room, staring at the wall. The constant noise, the constant pressure was starting to wear on him. He had pushed through it all so far, but now he was beginning to feel the toll it was taking on his body and mind. His phone buzzed once again, but this time it wasn't a hateful message or a threat. It was an invitation. It was from an activist group that had been growing in the wake of his video. They wanted him to speak at a national rally that would bring together voices from all over the country to fight for change. They wanted him to be a leader in the movement, to take his pain and turn it into action, to show the world that they couldn't silence him. For a moment, Daniel felt paralyzed. This was it. The moment he had been waiting for. This could be his chance to finally make a real difference. But what would it cost him? The risks were enormous. The spotlight, the pressure, the scrutiny, everything that had already pushed him to his limits would only intensify. Could he really carry the weight of this? His mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. But in the end, he knew what he had to do. He couldn't just talk about change. He had to show it. He had to be the one to lead. The next morning, he called the activist group back and told them he was in. The day of the national rally arrived, and with it came the same nervousness that had plagued Daniel since he first decided to speak out. This time, however, it felt different. The crowd was bigger, the stakes were higher, and for the first time in his life, Daniel felt like he was standing in front of something he could not ignore. The rally was held in Washington, D.C. Thousands of people gathered in front of the Capitol, signs raised high, chants filling the air. It was a sea of people, all demanding justice, demanding equality. Daniel had never seen anything like it. He had never realized how many people shared his pain, his frustration, his need for change. He had never felt more alive, more part of something important. When it was his turn to speak, Daniel felt his heart beat in his throat. He stepped up to the microphone, looking out over the crowd, feeling their eyes on him. There were so many faces, so many voices, but he wasn't afraid. He wasn't backing down. This was his moment. He took a deep breath and spoke, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Today, we stand together," Daniel said, his words echoing through the crowd. "We stand for justice. We stand for equality. We stand for the right to exist without fear, without hate, without being treated as less than. We stand because we are tired, tired of being erased, tired of being ignored, tired of being told we don't matter." The crowd erupted in applause, their energy filling the air like a current, charging every word Daniel spoke. "This isn't just about me," he continued. "This is about all of us. This is about the people who have been silenced for far too long. The people who have been told they don't belong. We are here, we are loud, and we are not going anywhere." The roar of the crowd was deafening. Daniel felt a rush of emotions flood through him. The weight of the fight, the grief, the anger, but also something new, a sense of power. He wasn't just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He was a leader, a voice, and this time no one could silence him. The roar of the crowd still echoed in Daniel's ears long after the rally ended. As he made his way off the stage, surrounded by volunteers and fellow activists, the feeling of having his voice heard, of standing tall for something bigger than himself, began to settle into his chest. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he had purpose. Like the weight of the injustice he had experienced was not a burden, but a rallying cry for others who had suffered in silence for too long. But with that sense of purpose came something else. Fear. Fear that the moment was fleeting, that the world would soon forget. Fear that the movements sparked by his words would fade into the background of people's lives, replaced by the next headline, the next tragedy. He knew this fight would be long, much longer than he had prepared for. He had only scratched the surface. The days following the rally were a blur of interviews, meetings, and planning for the next steps in the fight for justice. The media coverage had only intensified. His face, his story, had become a symbol. It was both empowering and terrifying. He was no longer just Daniel, a teenager trying to survive in a world that often seemed designed to make him invisible. Now, he was a leader in a movement. But leadership came with its own set of expectations, its own set of dangers. More messages flooded his inbox. Some were still hateful, filled with venomous insults, threats of violence, and racist slurs. Others were supportive, even heartwarming. People from all over the world sent messages of gratitude, telling him that his courage had given them the strength to speak out, to stand up for themselves. But there were also those who felt betrayed by his words, people who felt uncomfortable with the discomfort his story had caused. The police began their investigation into the guard's actions. The mall, under pressure, had suspended him indefinitely, but there were no guarantees that real justice would come from it. Daniel knew the system all too well. It was slow, it was broken, and it had a long history of letting people like the guard go without consequence. But he couldn't stop. He couldn't let this be a story that faded into the background. He wouldn't let Silver's death, his broken crutches, and the humiliation he had faced at the hands of that man go unnoticed. And yet, for every bit of support he received, there was always a voice of opposition, always someone who found a way to twist his actions into something ugly. "I saw your rally," one comment read. "Just another group trying to destroy our country. You don't belong here. Why don't you go back where you came from?" The words stung. They always did. But now, instead of feeling crushed by them, they fueled him. He didn't just want to fight back against the guard who had harmed him. He wanted to fight back against everything that had made him feel less than human, less than worthy, less than equal. The weight of the battle was heavier than he had imagined. But Daniel kept going. One afternoon, a week after the rally, Daniel found himself in the midst of another meeting. This one was with a lawyer who had reached out to him after seeing the video. She was an experienced civil rights attorney, someone who had taken on major cases involving police brutality, workplace discrimination, and other systemic injustices. She told him she believed he had a case, that what had happened to him went beyond the physical violence. It was about the culture of racism, the systemic dehumanization of people like him, the unchecked power of security officers who felt entitled to treat him however they saw fit. But the lawyer's words felt hollow to him, as if justice was an unreachable goal, one that existed only in the stories of others. He had heard of so many cases where the system had failed, where people like him had been silenced, their pain dismissed, their voices ignored. "I'm not doing this for me," Daniel said, his voice strained. "I'm doing this for everyone who has been made to feel invisible. I'm doing this for everyone who is afraid to speak up." The lawyer nodded, her face serious. "And that's why this case is so important. You're not just fighting for yourself. You're fighting for all those who have been silenced, for those who never got the chance to be heard." Daniel felt a wave of doubt wash over him. What if I fail? What if this was all for nothing? The question lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't afford to show weakness, not now, not when so much was riding on his words, his actions. The pressure only grew. The rally had brought together a vast number of supporters, but it had also drawn out the people who were willing to do anything to stop the momentum. There were protests, but not in support of him. There were counter-protests, hateful groups who painted him as a villain, as someone who was dividing the country, someone who was causing trouble for no reason other than to stir up racial tension. Every protest had its counter. Every march had its countermarch. It was exhausting. The media was relentless, often misrepresenting his words, twisting them to fit their own narratives. Some outlets painted him as a troublemaker, others painted him as a victim, someone who didn't deserve to be in the spotlight at all. The hypocrisy of it all was staggering. His friends, the ones who had been by his side during the early days, began to pull away. Some of them didn't know how to handle the sudden fame, the media frenzy, the constant pressure. Others didn't know how to deal with the constant harassment. And still others, despite their best intentions, simply didn't know how to support him. They had never experienced what he had gone through, and they didn't understand the weight of it. The loneliness was overwhelming at times. But Daniel pushed through it. He couldn't stop now. He had come too far, and the movement had gained too much momentum for him to back down. And then, there was the moment when everything started to shift. The guard was arrested. It wasn't the end of the battle, not by a long shot, but it was a victory. It was something tangible, something that proved that speaking out, demanding justice, wasn't a futile effort. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. The arrest didn't change the world, but it changed Daniel's perspective. It reminded him that even in the darkest times, change was possible. Justice wasn't just an ideal, it was a fight, a hard, ongoing struggle. But it was worth it. With the arrest, a sense of relief washed over him. But Daniel knew it wasn't enough. The work had only just begun. The fight was far from over. And as long as he could stand, as long as he had a voice, he would keep fighting. For himself, for Silver, for everyone who had been treated the way he had. The battle wasn't won, but it had been started. And that was enough to give him hope for the future. The arrest of the mall guard had been a turning point, but it hadn't been the end. It was only the beginning of a much larger, much more complex fight. The national spotlight that had turned to Daniel and his story now began to grow brighter. The eyes of the world focused on his every move, his every word, his every action. In the days following the guard's arrest, the courtroom battles began. The legal process moved slowly, but the public outcry was relentless. As news outlets and activists rallied behind Daniel, it became clear that this wasn't just about one person's wrongful treatment. It was about systemic issues that had long gone unaddressed. Racism in public spaces, discrimination in the workplace, and the abuse of power by those who were supposed to protect and serve. For Daniel, it was hard to wrap his mind around the scale of it all. He had wanted to be heard. He had wanted to make sure the world understood the pain and injustice he had faced. But now that his voice had grown louder, he realized just how much had been left unsaid. The hurt, the rage, the experiences of those who had come before him, they were all there, simmering beneath the surface. He wasn't just fighting for justice for himself anymore. He was fighting for every person who had ever been silenced, every person who had ever been told they didn't belong, every person who had suffered quietly in the shadows. And that fight was bigger than he had ever imagined. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. The world around Daniel continued to buzz, the noise of his fight growing louder every day. The courtroom was filled with reporters, activists, and onlookers, all waiting for the moment when the guard would face the consequences of his actions. But it wasn't just the trial that weighed on Daniel's mind. It was the aftermath, the toll this journey had taken on him. The pressure of being constantly watched, constantly under the microscope, was taking its toll. At home, his family had become even more protective, especially his mother. She spent more and more time at home, making sure Daniel wasn't left alone with his thoughts. His father, though supportive, often withdrew, retreating into his work or his hobbies, as if to avoid the heavy reality of their situation. It wasn't that they didn't care. It was that they didn't know how to help him navigate the overwhelming weight of it all. Daniel had always been good at keeping his emotions in check, at hiding his pain beneath a mask of calm. But the stress of the constant media presence, the unrelenting stream of hateful comments, the threats on his life, everything was beginning to break through. He wasn't sure how much longer he could keep it together. One night, as he sat in his room, the glow of his phone casting shadows on the walls, he found himself staring at a message that stood out from the rest. It wasn't a hateful comment or a threatening message. It was a simple text from a classmate, one he hadn't spoken to in years. The message read, "I've been thinking about what you've been going through. I don't have all the answers, but I want you to know I'm here. I see you." Daniel stared at the words, his heart heavy. It wasn't much, but it was the first time someone had acknowledged his humanity, his pain, without judgment. It was the first time someone had said those words to him, not out of pity, but out of understanding. For the first time in months, Daniel allowed himself to breathe. He didn't have to fight alone. He had allies, and together they could make a difference. The court date arrived, and Daniel found himself standing before the judge, the same guard sitting across from him, his lawyer by his side, stoic and silent. The sight of the man who had hurt him, who had crushed Silver, who had made him feel less than human, was almost too much to bear. He wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice, but he held it in. He had come this far. He would not let himself fall now. The trial was a spectacle. Every move Daniel made was scrutinized. Every word he spoke was dissected. The defense team tried to paint him as the aggressor, trying to discredit his story, to undermine his pain. But Daniel had the truth on his side. He had the video. He had the witnesses. And most importantly, he had the strength to see it through. As the trial dragged on, the courtroom was filled with tension. The defense attorney's arguments were weak, nothing more than attempts to deflect, to create confusion. But when it came time for Daniel to speak, he did so with a calm that shocked even himself. He stood in front of the judge and the jury, his voice steady, his eyes clear. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Daniel said, his words ringing out in the silence of the courtroom. "This is about a system that allows people like him to get away with it. This is about the countless others who have been silenced, who have been made to feel like they don't matter. This is about changing that." The courtroom was silent. The jury, the judge, the spectators, they were all listening now. They were no longer just hearing Daniel's story. They were hearing the story of everyone who had been ignored, pushed aside, and discarded. When the verdict finally came, the tension in the room was unbearable. Daniel sat in the chair, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding in his chest. The judge spoke, and when the words came, when the guard was found guilty on all charges, a wave of relief washed over Daniel. It wasn't a perfect victory, and it wasn't enough to fix everything. But it was a victory nonetheless. The system had been forced to reckon with what had happened. The guard would be held accountable. The courtroom erupted into applause. Daniel stood, his legs shaking, but his heart stronger than ever. He had done it. They had done it. The fight wasn't over, but it had taken a significant step forward. But as Daniel walked out of the courthouse, surrounded by reporters and activists, he realized that the fight was far from over. This was just one battle in a much larger war. The court case had been won, but the work, the real work, was just beginning. The system had been forced to take notice, but it would take more than just one case to dismantle the ingrained prejudice and racism that had shaped his life. As he walked through the crowd, Daniel looked up at the sky. The weight of the world was still heavy on his shoulders, but now there was a glimmer of hope in his chest. The road ahead would be long, and it would be hard, but Daniel knew one thing for sure. He would never stop fighting. Not for himself, not for Silver, not for anyone else who had been silenced. He was done being invisible. He was done being silenced, and he wasn't going to let anyone ever make him feel like he didn't belong again. As we come to the end of this story, we'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Have you ever faced racism or injustice in your own life? Your experiences are incredibly important to us. We truly value each and every one of you, and your voice matters. If you found this story impactful, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss future content. Your support means a lot to us. Wishing you all a great day ahead. And if you're still with us, drop a phrase in the comments related to the theme of standing up against injustice so we know you listened all the way through. We appreciate all of you.